Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we'll be talking about ethics, the SAICA CPC or the SAICA Code of Professional Conduct to be specific. So this video is about what the CPC is about, how to read it, and most importantly, how to get those marks, because that's why you're here, I'm sure. Let's get into it. So you'll recall a few weeks ago that we spoke about professional ethics, about the fact that members of a particular profession are bound by certain ethical requirements. For chartered accountants in South Africa, that is the SAICA CPC. So what is it? Why is it important? Please make sure to watch my prelude to this video that discusses why that's important. But more than that, the SAICA CPC sets out the fact that members are supposed to display certain fundamental principles. Those fundamental principles are integrity, objectivity, professional behavior, professional competence and due care, and confidentiality. This is to say that at any given point in time, you are supposed to comply with those fundamental principles. What the CPC then does is that it is divided into 3 sections. So you have the section that deals with these fundamental principles. So the CPC is then broken up into 2 parts, right? So you have the section that's applicable to PAs, so professional accountants. That would include CAs, trainees who are not CAs as yet, and other members or other holders of designations that are housed by SAICA. That would include your AGAs and so on and so forth, right? So depending on where you work, that will determine where in the code you're supposed to go and look. Right. So what do I mean by this? So if you are, for example, a PA that works in audit, you will need to go to a specific section of the CPC to go see how you are supposed to conduct yourself. And then if you are, say, work as a lecturer, you go to a different portion of the CPC. So I would advise that you make sure that you understand the definitions of a PA in business versus a PA in public practice that is actually defined for you there. This is very crucial because depending on the type of PA that you're dealing with, you will need to go to a specific section in your CPC. So in terms of how it's divided, you have part 1 of your CPC, which basically discusses the fundamental principles and what you ought to know about them. What do they mean? And then you have the specific sections. You have part 2, which specifically deals with PAs in business. PA in business is actually a defined term in your CPC, so just please make sure to go look that up. And then you have parts 3 and parts 4, which are applicable to PAs that are in public practice. Again, this is very important. Please make sure that you are able to distinguish between the 2, because it's very easy for someone who's marking to tell that you're in the wrong part of the CPC, right? So another thing that I wanted to say is that, as you can appreciate, part 2, for example, which deals with PA in business, will not be able to set out every single scenario that a PA in business will face in doing their job, right? So it's more of how do I put this? It's more of a guideline to say, okay, fine, if you're dealing with this specific thing, if you have to deal, for example, with gifts and hospitality, how are you as a PA in business supposed to handle this? And if you had to deal with gifts and hospitality as someone who works in public practice, how are you going to deal with it? You're then going to find a specific section that is going to detail to you how you are to handle all of these things. But sometimes you will come across something that is not defined. that doesn't have a specific section in part 2 of the CPC, what then happens? What will happen is that you're then going to fall back on part 1 of the CPC. So think of part 1 of the CPC as the framework for ethical discussions, particularly as it relates to SAICA CPC, right? So if you can't find a specific section dealing with something, then you have to fall back on part 1 as a framework to say, all right, at a minimum, right, would a member be able to comply with these fundamental principles? So would integrity be breached? Would professional behavior be breached? And so on and so forth. So the same way that you, or the same way that you do it for accounting, where if you are, looking at a transaction and for the life of you, you don't know under which standard to account it under, what you would then do is you would go back to the framework and basically go back to the basics to say, but based on the framework, how would I classify this thing? What is it? How would I go about recognizing it? And so on and so forth. So part 1 of the CPC is precisely that. Now, what do students struggle with here? Students struggle with a lot of things. So first and foremost, they don't always know when the CPC is applicable. So you will be given, for example, a board of directors, and then you get told that, they did something ethical, whatever that thing is. And then students want to force apply the CPC to members of the board. The CPC only applies to people who are members of SAICA, right? So if you have someone in the board of directors who is a CA, AGA, and so on and so forth, then the CPC will apply to them. The other people are not bound by it, just as you are not bound by the ethical code for doctors because you are not a doctor. I cannot emphasize this enough, right? So the CPC will only be applicable if there is a CA involved. That's thing number 1 that I wanted you guys to remember. And then another thing that I want to talk about is the method in which you're going to discuss the items, right? So if, for example, you get told that there is someone who's a CA who is being bribed for, say, a good audit opinion, first and foremost, you need to know under which parts of the CPC would you need to go look. So definitely part 1 as the framework, and parts 3 and 4 because of the fact that this is actually someone practicing in public practice, right? So you would then go in and say, okay, fine, where would I need to go? Is there a specific section that deals with this issue? If not, then you're going to fall back on part 1. If, say, for example, there are issues, so if they're being bribed, you would then go to the section that deals with hospitality and gifting, and I forget the exact term. And then you would say to yourself, okay, fine, self, what do I then write? How do I earn the marks? Then you need to follow, it's almost a 5-step approach, where you need to say, okay, fine, what is the issue? What exactly is the issue? So what is the problem here? The problem is that we have a PA in public practice who wants to be bribed, or who someone's trying to bribe them or to offer them a gift in exchange for a good audit outcome, right? What are the fundamental principles that are being affected here, or rather what type of a threat is it, right? So what kind of a threat would this be? Is it a self-interest threat? Is it an intimidation threat? Is it a now I can't think at the back of my mind, but I know you guys know them well. What is the type of threat that I'm faced with here? All of those threats, the different types of threats are actually defined as well in part 1 of your CPC. So just make sure that you familiarize yourself with them. And then you would say, but which fundamental principles are being breached? Is it integrity? Is it professional behavior? Is it confidentiality? It all depends on the facts and circumstances of the scenario. Now, another thing that I want to just highlight before I finish the rest of the steps is to then say, depending on what level you're at, right? So if you're very lower in your degree, it might be okay to just list, to say, fine, I have a self-interest threat to integrity, and that might earn you a mark. The higher up you go in your degree, we're looking for, or rather the examiner's usually looking for more of an explanation with regard to why you've decided on those particular threats. So you'd say it's a self-interest threat because of 1, 2, 3. It is a threat to integrity because of 1, 2, 3. Obviously, you're not going to write 1, 2, 3, but I know that. But you would try and apply it to the facts and circumstances of your scenario as much as you can. Step 4 would then be for you to say, all right, fine, is this something that is forgivable? Like, is this threat at an acceptable level or not? So would I be content with just like the presence of this threat? Does it change anything? Could it impair, my objectivity? Could it affect how others, a third person who views and is aware of the facts and circumstances, could it lead them to believe that something improper had actually taken place? And so some of the sections then go into specific guidance on how do you decide if something is at an acceptable level or not. So I know, for instance, the section on gifting deals with such things as, for example, the timing of the gift, the intent of the gift. Is that person giving you a gift customary to whatever circumstances that's happening? So if you, for example, as an audit partner, received a wedding gift from your client because you had a wedding, is that improper versus someone who just gives you a gift out of nowhere? And the type of gift, the value of the gift. If someone gives you, say, a MacBook versus someone who gives you a 200 Rand voucher for lunch, do you guys see what I'm saying? So depending on that, those are the circumstances that you'd need to kind of discuss to say, are you content about the fact that this threat is at an acceptable level or not? If it is not at an acceptable level, so you can't just say the threat is not at an acceptable level. You have to go into some form of discussion and say, it's not an acceptable level because, for example, the value is a bit too high, the intent behind the gift, the timing, the expectation with regard to what the auditor is supposed to do in return, say a good audit outcome, would be inappropriate, and therefore this gift, or rather the threat of the threats that we're talking about here would be at an acceptable, would not be at an acceptable level. And so because of that, it would lead us into step 5. What are the safeguards that need to be implemented to either remove the threat altogether or to mitigate the impact or the potential impact of that threat? And again, some of the sections would also set out some suggested safeguards that a person would need to, or rather that the PA would need to put in place to ensure that that threat is eventually reduced to an acceptable level. So in summary, I would say that the challenges within this topic lie in being able to, number one, identify whether or not the CPC is applicable in that particular circumstance or to certain people within the scenario. And I'd say number 2 would be in identifying the type of PA that you're dealing with. Is it a PA in business? Is it a PA in public practice? And then I'd say the next thing that students would struggle with is just, discussing that thing as part of like a logical process where you take me through, this is the issue, these are the types of threats this is the fundamental principle that's affected, this is, my assessment of whether the threat is at an acceptable level or not, and then finally this is what I would need to see as a safeguard in order to be convinced that this threat has been reduced to an acceptable level. And I'd say after you've done all of that, then you should be able to earn the marks. And then I think another thing that students could potentially struggle with is the issue around being able to knowing where to go with regard to an issue. Like if you don't know what you don't know. So if you're seeing something, if you're not aware of the fact that there is a specific section within the CPC that deal with this particular issue, you're obviously not going to know to go there, right? So similar to my advice on the Companies Act, I would say, go in your table of contents, search through what's there, just kind of, scan through like what types of things are there within this particular section. And then if you know what's there and if you know what to do and where to go, then you're not going to struggle. So I would say that would be my 2 cents advice. And then lastly, I think it's always easy to answer the sections that have supporting sections for that particular scenario. The challenge comes in when, after reading the thing, you're like, but where do I go? How do I answer that? And I think being able to put together a logical argument purely based on part 1 of the CPC is actually much more difficult in my view. So if you're able to do that well and you're able to explain what the issues really are, I think that you're going to do well. And while I have you here, I thought let's just discuss the APA. So this is also a very common question that you can get really at any level. You are essentially tried or supposed to look at the scenario and then determine if the auditor is supposed to do something about a reportable irregularity. So first and foremost, you'd need to determine if a reportable irregularity exists. Now, what is that? It's actually defined for you in the Act. So it's going to be, a whole bunch of those steps, and then you're going to then apply per step what you need to do here. One thing that I just wanted to highlight about this, and mistakes that I've seen from students over the years, is that the determining whether something complies or is an RI is a hoops process. So you have multiple hoops that you need to jump in order for you to conclude that something is a reportable irregularity. So it goes without saying that if you're unable to cross some of the hoops, there is no way you could potentially conclude that there is a reportable irregularity. So what are those hoops? So the first hoops is so the first hoop is the unlawful omission or act. Yes, the unlawful act or omission, right? So in order for a reportable irregularity to exist, you need to be able to jump that first hoop. Now, interestingly, this is a part that students sometimes struggle with. They're not able to fully demonstrate what the issue is, or if the issue is actually illegal. So I recall one year I had a question in one of my tests where the company, because of COVID and so on and so forth, was not able to pay off their debt as they became due. So because of that, they had to make alternative arrangements with their suppliers so that they could pay, and so on and so forth. And so the question then becomes, what is the illegal act there? And a lot of my students at the time got it wrong because they kept saying that the unlawful act is the fact that they are missing payments, right? So they said missing payments is actually an unlawful act. And as part of the debrief after that assessment, I said to them, how many of you guys here have skipped a debt? Have not paid a debt as in when it became due? And how many of you guys were arrested as a result of that? They laughed at the ridiculousness of it all, because they've now realized that they were not focusing on the correct part in terms of the unlawful act component or the unlawful act part, right? So skipping payments is not the illegal thing. The illegal thing must always be tied back to a piece of legislation. So if by not paying, for example, I now open up Section 22 of the Companies Act, I now open up Section 76 of the Companies Act because of these actions, and I can now prove that I am not able to comply with those sections, then it becomes an unlawful act. But what else? What other example can I give? So I remember there was one where the people were the directors like changed the labels of the expiry dates and stuff like that. In order for you to say that is an unlawful act, the changing of the labels, the change of the labels is not wrong as such, right? But then also intent comes into play. The type of product that you're selling also comes into play. What will the impact of that be? What will that, the impact of that, what will that be? The impact of you changing those labels, what is that going to be? And are there pieces of legislation that prevent you from doing that? Again, Section 22 comes to mind. Section 76 comes to mind. The Consumer Protection Act comes to mind, and so on and so forth. So you must almost like go that additional step of saying that this is the issue, and because this is the issue, it brings into question the company's ability to comply with this particular section. So if you have not gone that additional step where you've just told me what the issue is, you cannot say that the issue on its own is unlawful act. You need to show me how that issue translates into an illegal or an unlawful act or omission somewhere, somehow, in some piece of legislation. So that's the first hoop that you need to jump. So it goes without saying that if you have not been able to jump that first hoop, it doesn't even matter what happens with the rest of the hoops. If you can't prove unlawful, right, you're going to have a hard time, if possible, in proving the fact that anything else is actually will rise to the level of reportable irregularity. The second hoop has to do with has to be committed by management. So this unlawful act has to be committed by management. You again need to be able to prove this. Management, we're not talking about management in the real sense of the word. We're talking about the management of the company. So like the big guys with the muscles, right? So if the board of directors is in on this, if the people who actually have the power to like bind the company with regard to certain decisions and decision making, if they are the ones committing the unlawful act, then you've now jumped the first hoop. The third and final hoop is actually has like alternatives. So it can either lead to a material financial loss. I can't remember what the other things are off by memory, but so you'll see that it's an or test. So if it's a breach of fiduciary duty, if it leads to material financial loss, and so on and so forth, or if it leads to ABC, then you will have jumped the third and final hoop. If you're able to jump all three of those hoops, well done. You have a reportable irregularity. If not, you do not have one. So one of the things that I've also noticed is that students don't always know when to talk about the actions that need to be taken versus just stopping at saying we have an RI and just call it a day. So just go back into your learner guide and read what the differences, or your question bank, and see what the differences between these questions is. So when a question says to you, considerations, or are we dealing with an RI or not, or can the auditor conclude that this is an RI or not, you need to know where you need to stop. Do you apply the definition, jump through the hoops, and then say, yes, we're dealing with an RI? Or must you, over and above that, take it a bit further and say, now that I do have an RI, I need to do these things without delay. I need to report to the RBA within 30 days or within 3 days or whatever. All of those steps that are set out in the APA. So just go and familiarize yourself with the differences in terms of how these questions could be asked, and I think you will do well. So I'm going to try and find a question. I have two in mind, actually two ITC questions in mind that deal with the CPC specifically, so that I can show you what I was talking about the different challenges that candidates have, and hopefully help you to be able to score the marks. I hope you found this video to be helpful. I'll see you guys next time.